It's been a week since the mass shooting at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas, where 19 children and two teachers were killed. And a lot has happened in the aftermath of this horrific mass shooting. We've seen the governor of Texas admit that information he gave to the public the day after the shooting was false. We've seen a Texas law enforcement agency investigating the shooting admit that the police waited too long before going into the school. We've even seen the U.S. Department of Justice indicate that it will review law enforcement actions on that day. Against this backdrop, the families, the community, and the entire nation continues to struggle to make sense of this senseless tragedy and to start the healing process. We too, on the special report, are trying to make sense of how this could happen and what lessons have been learned to prevent the next school shooting. Experts weigh in, all coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
We know that mass shootings have become so common in this country. In fact, there were 27 school shootings this year alone, 119 since 2018. And we've seen in the aftermath of the Uvalde shooting, lots of experts, law enforcement experts, public officials come forward to try to help the public make sense of what's happened. Unfortunately, a lot of the information that was given by Texas law enforcement agencies and elected officials, including the governor, was false, inaccurate, and at best confusing, conflicting stories about whether the gunman confronted a school officer that was armed, whether the door was left open, how many officers arrived at the scene, how long did it take them to arrive, what actually happened to prevent the police from going in and actually taking this gunman out. So many conflicting stories, and also reports about what the police should have done, what lessons we've learned as a community, as a country, and as law enforcement from shootings dating back to the Columbine shooting. Today, we're trying to make sense ourselves of what the information that's been coming out about the shooting, what it all means, and what we can expect from law enforcement going forward. Because some of these stories, quite frankly, are horrifying and really disgusting when you think about those families that were outside begging and begging police officers to take action. Those horrifying 9/11 calls indicating that there were people, there were kids still alive while the police sat outside the school and, from the looks of it, did nothing. Here to help us make sense of what was going on in the minds of some of those officers and the actions that we witnessed and those that we still don't know a whole lot about is the chief of police for the Los Angeles International Airport. He's also a candidate for Los Angeles Sheriff. He's been on the show before. His name is Chief Cedric Rambo. Good morning, Chief Rambo. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm certain that you, like the rest of the public, have been watching these reports that are coming out of Uvalde, Texas, conflicting reports from different law enforcement agencies, sometimes conflicting reports from the same law enforcement agency. So we're just trying to make sense of what happened that day where these 19 children and two teachers were killed. And what we're hearing a lot about, Chief, is the changes that occurred after the Columbine shooting in 1999. And help us understand what law enforcement's response was to an active shooter on a school campus pre-Columbine and what the response should look like post-Columbine.
Yeah, Reva, thank you for having me. First of all, sending out my prayers. And on that day, literally, my heart was broken. I read that and my heart literally just sank. Pre-Columbine, active shooter scenarios were so rare that we typically isolate the suspect. We take terrain, we contain folks, and then we evacuate. And then we hold off and let the hostage negotiators come in and the SWAT team and we stage and that kind of thing. After Columbine, we realized that we really had to be assertive and actively aggress the shooter or shooters. And also in Columbine, people forget there were also IEDs or improvised explosive devices there too. So there's secondary things that we have to pay attention to as we're going in. But the bottom line is what Columbine taught us is that you had to aggress. You're the first responding officers. You and I get out of our patrol car and we go to the sounds of the shots.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that. As a responding officer, you go to the sounds of the shot. So we saw in the Parkland School District case, there was police, school police on site, and there was again conflicting information about what that responder did. Was he hiding, trying to protect himself from the shooter, or was he, calling for backup? Exactly what he was doing, and this is surfaced again with Uvalde and questions about why these officers waited so long, and some questioning whether these officers were in fact afraid themselves to engage with a shooter that had this kind of assault weapon. We see firemen on television shows and we think of firemen as being trained to rush into a burning building. Are police officers taught that if there's a shooting going on, even if it's involving some assault weapons and you just have your standard police issued gun, are you supposed to run into a building where there's active shooting going on the way firemen have to run into burning buildings?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. In terms of looking at an active shooter, the worst active shooter case we saw was of course, the North Hollywood bank robbery, where you had fully automatic weapons and they were out in the open shooting. And of course, the officers were engaging in that. But certainly in this scenario, when you have someone engaged in actively shooting inside a building, particularly a school, you are supposed to aggress the sounds of the shots. And at the same time, you're supposed to be coordinating units in and communicating with your responding personnel. It sounds to me like there should be some training. I would be curious as to when the last time they did active shooter training, what equipment they had available to them, such as ballistic shields, and how often you train for those scenarios really makes it a habit where you just act instinctually rather than you hesitate.
And it's interesting that you bring that up about the training because there are some reports that this chief and the chief that has gotten a lot of attention is the chief of the school police. And apparently he is someone who supervised only 6 officers. So, I mean, this is a small, cadre of officers that this particular chief was in charge of. And they said he had tactical command. So he was the one calling the shots in terms of what the other officers who arrived on the scene would do. And they said he had just had active shooting training 2 months ago. So is a chief of a force that small, 6 people, is he getting the same tactical training that you think of when you think of elite law enforcement agencies? Those at the federal level, is that chief of 6 people going to train like FBI SWAT team?
Yeah, normally what happens, for instance, I went through SWAT school myself, and there were other agencies, Inglewood PD and other agencies in our SWAT school. So yes, a chief of a small agency would go to a larger SWAT school and get that training. So that's what I would theorize. I don't know for sure if that's what that chief went through. And then we have such a small cadre of personnel working in the school environment. I'm not sure how well they were equipped, how well they were trained, how often they went to training. So those are all things that we need to take a look at.
And so there's been a lot of talk, and help us understand this as from a law enforcement standpoint, between an active shooter situation and then at some point it became a barricade situation, and they're making a lot of noise about that. What are the differences and what changes in terms of what the law enforcement response should be based on those different scenarios?
Well, an active shooter is by definition what it is, someone who's actively shooting and engaging people. In which an officer is, trained to go in. They become barricaded if they're by themselves. There's nobody else in the house. There's no hostages there, and then that way you can contain, isolate, evacuate. That kind of thing. Those are what you see sometimes at 450 or family disturbances where, everybody's out the house, but the person is in the house armed and they don't want to come out. So that's a barricade. In this scenario, you had students in the classroom, you had people calling 911 from inside the location, you had an armed suspect. That is a time to aggress and attack that particular room, understanding that there are other people there who are innocent, but at the same time, that's what you saw the Border Patrol SWAT team do. They finally went in, and really aggress that suspect. But, obviously 40 minutes too late.
Would it be the case that, and you mentioned that Border Patrol team, again, highly trained tactical team, works for the Border Patrol federal agency. So if there is a situation like we saw at the school, Robb Elementary, where the school police, uh, I presume, would be the first agency in control, but yet when the Border Patrol police show up, do they have to defer to this chief, even though these Border Patrol officers obviously are more skilled in this kind of, situation? Like, who's in charge?
Technically, the chief there who is in tactical command is in charge. So if my SWAT team rolls up to a scenario like that, we're gonna suit up, get a quick briefing, and find out what the heck is going on, and then we're going to aggress. Now, if we roll up and there are shots being fired, we're going to want to know who's inside, like other officers. What is the scenario, and then we're going to go in. We're going to start approaching and going in right away. And so at that point, tactical control goes over to that emergency services or that SWAT team that comes in, and then the tactical commander from SWAT will work with the chief.
So why would the Border Patrol, if they rolled up, why would they listen, to put it mildly, to this chief saying, we're waiting? Why wouldn't they roll up and just take over and storm the building?
I really can't speak to that. I wasn't there. I don't know all the facts, but I do know that typically there's a briefing, like a handoff, so they have an idea of what the scenario is, where the classroom is, where the sounds came from. So there's a bit of intelligence that they have to get. Why they deferred, I really don't know. I can't really speak to that.
And we did hear some 911 calls, at least the dispatcher relaying to the officers outside the building that they were getting calls from people who were obviously getting calls, they're still alive, begging for help. Would that not be enough information for whomever's in control, the chief or the Border Patrol, to then use that information to storm? Like, this whole handoff and just setting up a perimeter, maybe calling in a negotiator, all that, we see that being done in various television shows, but, time is of the essence here. And if you're getting your dispatcher saying, look, there are kids calling from that classroom, they're still alive, wouldn't that be enough to prompt these officers to run into this building?
One would think so. And all the things that you mentioned about containing and evacuating folks and calling in the hostage negotiator, all of that stuff can be done simultaneously. So when we set up a command post, we have a scribe and a person that's starting all those things into motion as the team that's aggressing goes in. So all of these things happen simultaneously. So when you have 911 calls and you have people calling for help and you've already had shots fired at that situation, my guess, and I can only guess, is that at that point, they had a hostage situation and they decided to slow things down and maybe get a negotiator in. I don't know, but I wasn't there in the communications, but I certainly wish that the officers initially on scene had gone in and aggressed.
Yeah, so, we're hearing reports that at one point there were 19 officers inside the school. That those officers, apparently had an opportunity to go into the classroom, but did not. There's all kinds of confusion about who had the key, where was the key. Did some of these local officers have the shields and other equipment that you talked about in their trunks of their car? Maybe not. The SWAT team is a part-time SWAT team. So, it's a small community. So, it's not operating like a big city. But again, a lot of experts seem to be dancing around this notion that perhaps these police were afraid to go in and engage with this shooter because they know how dangerous it is. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, honestly, everybody's, if you're not afraid, then you're foolish, right? But the bottom line is, we have to display courage, and uncommon valor at a time when it's needed. And so, this is a classic example of a very high risk situation with what happens in very, very low frequency. And it's not uncommon for areas like this, where it's kind of a smaller town. They just don't think things like this will happen. And so they're psychologically not prepared for it. And so all of those things come into effect. And one of the things that we like to say, at least in our profession here in LA, is if you're always ready, you never have to get ready. So thinking tactically, thinking that, yes, it could happen. At the airport, we're always on heightened state of alert. Anything could happen here in LA. But in a small town like that, they probably weren't thinking or emotionally ready for something like that.
Yeah, Chief, we saw a lot of parents outside begging, police to do something. Apparently, at some point, the parents could hear the shots themselves. We saw some parents were arrested, some were pushed to the ground. Do you ever have situations where officers, rather than arresting the parents, just say, I'm going to run in this building. I know my chief has said we're going to wait, but I hear danger and I intuitively feel like I should run in. Does that ever happen where you have, someone break ranks with their commanding officer?
Well, in those situations, I haven't personally had that. There's a number of scenarios. Well, a situation like that could also cause some issues. Also, if you had 19 officers inside the location and then someone breaks ranks and starts running in, you have to make sure there's, not friendly fire things going on. So things have to be somewhat coordinated. But again, it boils down to the training. Because he had a long rifle. Let's say he had taken up a position out at a window. He could have very easily shot the parents. He could have shot up the command post, depending on where they set it up. So there's a lot of things that go into these scenarios that this school and every school, and no matter what, should train for. And take a look at this as a after action report and look at what they can do better.
Yeah, I think, Chief, there's also obviously these parents so upset, so angry, so frustrated, and again, asking themselves, why didn't the police do something? Why didn't they do more? Why didn't they do it sooner? And I think as the public, we're thinking about those images where we've seen protests, say after the George Floyd's murder, where police are showing up in military style gear, in tanks, even the Kyle Rittenhouse situation. We're seeing cops in tanks driving down streets of cities in our country. And yet in this situation, we're hearing about the equipment's not available, the SWAT team is part-time, and we're juxtaposing those images of this militarized police force that can use that military gear against unarmed protesters. But yet when there is an active shooter and kids, fourth graders, lives are at stake, we didn't see that same kind of militarized response, or at least in a way that we would envision it happening. Help us understand those two images that are playing out in the minds, I think, of so many Americans.
Yeah, well, having been a platoon commander and a squad leader during demonstrations, oftentimes when you see that come out, it's really after preparation. Things have really escalated, and so you start deploying this equipment. In a spontaneous event like that occurred in Texas, some of that equipment may not have even been available. We don't even know. I don't know how far the Border Patrol even drove to get there. So once those things happen spontaneously, that small school police department, I'd be willing to bet, does not have any of that kind of equipment. And really the local police agency may have it, but I don't know how equipped they are. So getting that equipment out there on a spontaneous event is not like, amassing it for a large scale demonstration that we often have intelligence that's going to occur.
Another question, again, curious about, why don't we see more police officers supporting bans on assault weapons? If you all are the people that have to run into this danger, and we've heard so much about how an assault weapon just rips the bodies of people who've been shot apart, like these fourth graders, some of them not even recognizable. Why aren't more officers saying, look, we, the law enforcement agencies, should have these rifles, these guns, but we don't want the bad guys, or just anybody, bad or not, because a good person can turn into a bad person pretty easily and quickly. Why are more officers supporting those kinds of bans? Because obviously you don't want to run into a building with somebody with an AR-15 rifle shooting at you.
Right. Well, you know what? Honestly, I don't really get it. I mean, personally, I don't have an assault weapon or miniguns at all. But a lot of officers are, gun folks, and they like to have a lot of different type of weapons, or they come from the military, and so they like these weapons. I don't really understand it either. I'm supporting an assault weapons ban personally. And I sat on the Women Against Gun Violence board. But, I think by and large, Americans in general feel like, well, if so-and-so has this assault weapon, then I certainly need a weapon, of equal, capacity. And it's really unnecessary because, quite frankly, there's enough guns in America to, create as much violence and mayhem as we've seen anyway. You don't need an assault weapon to do it. So I don't know why officers, law enforcement folks, or even people in general cling so, mightily to these types of weapons. I think it's a power thing. I'm not exactly sure.
And just finally, we've heard a lot about solutions, potential solutions. Everything from, just make sure doors at schools are locked because apparently this door was left slightly unlocked. We've seen these active shooter drills that even our first graders have to go through. A senator, Ted Cruz, says put an armed officer at the front of one door. Have one door in, one door out for all schools, and then put an armed officer there. And then, of course, there's arming the teachers. Make sure that the teachers have guns. So, you've been in law enforcement for decades. You've been exposed to these kinds of mass shootings. Do any of those solutions make sense to you?
No, I look, first of all, I mean, security is really layers of inconvenience. So really what you have to have, certainly have cameras, certainly have vigilance. I certainly would recommend some type of security personnel on campus. Arming teachers is not, I don't think that's wise because one, not everybody is capable. And two, when a shooting does occur, you're going to assume that they're going to perform the way they should. And if you've never been in those scenarios, you really, really just have no idea how you're going to perform. Parents may not want their teachers to be armed. We don't want guns inside the classroom. I mean, there's too many other scenarios that could be, harmful in that manner. I think really what needs to happen is for us law enforcement, let's talk a little bit about the mental health piece. It's not uncommon for us to go and know which neighbor we've gone to their house 4 or 5 times. They've displayed aggressive behavior towards their neighbors. But what we don't really do is like a real thorough threat assessment and how dangerous is this person and how potentially, problematic can this person be in the future. Maybe we need to look at a threat assessment program nationwide because cops contact, people that are kind of off kilter every day. So, looking at that and then making sure that everybody does, run, hide, or fight, they understand that concept. But what's a 4th grader going to do, quite frankly, right? So making sure that your doors are secured is really, really important. And then making sure that safety is always on the forefront of everyone's mind, just in case.
Yeah, well, the mental health issue is a little interesting because we saw Governor Abbott come out strongly for mental health, even though he has not been a proponent in the past and he's done things to block mental health and other health care to the citizens of the state of Texas. But what good does it do to have mental health assessments in a state like Texas where you don't even need to have a license to have a gun? So somebody has mental health issues, you won't even know when they're attempting to buy a gun. So the mental health piece, I get disturbed by it because it seems like there's this association that somehow people that have mental health, one, are dangerous, which is, I think, we know completely false. And two, if we're not going to go the extra steps, what good is it to do mental health if we're not going to also then have red flag laws and other ways to flag individuals who have mental health issues, the kind of mental health issues that makes them dangerous? Because we know lots of people suffer from anxiety, depression, and we're not dangerous. So we want to be clear about that. So one without the other doesn't get you very much.
I wholeheartedly agree with you. I think at some point our policymakers have to really have the courage to implement common sense weapon safety and gun laws. I don't know why we won't do it. If you're afraid of losing your seed, I don't know. But I think the bottom line is I don't know how many, if killing children hasn't gotten your attention, I'm not sure what will.
Yeah. Well, we know that lots of children, unfortunately, 27 school shootings this year alone, Chief Rambo, and doesn't seem to be enough. But, there are talks going on now between the House members themselves or amongst the House members themselves. And hopefully we're going to see some changes coming out of, our Congress when they return from the holiday break. Thank you so much for sitting down with us. Good luck in your race. I know that's coming up. Are people already voting in the County of Los Angeles and will continue to vote through June 7th? So we'll see you soon, and thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule and your campaign schedule to help us make sense of this senseless shooting.
Well, I appreciate it,
Fred. All right, my next guest is Dr. Earl is what he goes by, Earl Turner. He is a psychologist whose work focuses on mental health among diverse racial communities, and he's the author of a new book. It's called Mental Health Among African Americans. Welcome back to the show, Dr. Turner. I know that you do a lot of work around mental health and racial diverse communities, and we've seen two different minority communities have been impacted recently by, the senseless gun violence, mass shootings. One in Buffalo involving African Americans. We saw the oldest member of that shooting, 84-year-old grandmother who was just laid to rest on Saturday. The vice president actually showed up at that funeral and gave some encouraging words to the family and community. And now we have these predominantly Latinx, Hispanic families in Texas who are having to bury children. Two teachers, one teacher's husband even dies after he goes to see the memorial for his wife. What kind of trauma, Dr. Turner, are these families experiencing at this moment?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for having me for this conversation. I think, one of the things that we know from these types of incidents is that people do struggle with a lot of things in terms of grief and trauma. But I think we have to recognize that oftentimes it takes time before the symptoms really elevate to that level. So I think right now, many people are just sort of in shock and dealing with that grief and a lot of numbness. So I think for people who may even develop some of the trauma symptoms, that right now there's probably a lot of numbness that they may be experiencing and not really knowing sort of how to move forward after these incidents.
The little girl, I'm sure you've seen her, who took her friend's blood, smeared it on her own body, and played dead so she wouldn't get shot. What possibly can be done to help someone like her heal through this situation? There's all of the survivors' grief that we know survivors of, plane crashes or mass shootings feel. But this even goes further than your standard survivor because she wasn't like, someone who's running away from the danger and gets away. She had to live through it.
Absolutely. And I think the biggest thing that we know from looking at some of the research on people who experience gun violence is that the closer that you are to those situations, and obviously if you are in that environment, that you're more likely to experience sort of more severe mental health difficulties or trauma such as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, after these incidents. So I think really being mindful of these little kids and how they may re-experience these types of events. So having nightmares about the situations or even sort of being re-triggered around discussions about these types of events. And so I think those are the types of things that we have to be concerned about and continue to have this ongoing monitoring about these situations, because we know, we have crisis counselors that oftentimes go into these situations, and that's really helpful in that moment, but you're not really processing the events that are going to require some long-term types of treatment. And I think those are the things that we have to really work towards addressing those sort of long-term needs of these kids.
And the teacher's husband, he goes to the memorial, where his wife was killed, and then he comes home and dies of a heart attack. How common is that, the heartbreak heart attack?
Yeah, I think we see that happening fairly often in spouses of those that die, in terms of the grief that they experience and how that sort of adds additional stressors on them. And if I recall, was a cardiovascular incident that sort of led to his death. And so I think just sort of all of those factors that we understand in terms of what is that connection between our mental and physical health. And that's something that I talk a lot about. And so I think really making sure that for people who experience any type of, tragic situation like this, is that you do, give them as much love and care at that time that you can to really try to support them. And obviously, this is a difficult situation for many people to be in, but trying to be able to sort of support those people in those times of crisis is really important.
The chief said if the killing of little kids doesn't cause people to rethink how they, process gun safety laws or move those in elected positions to enacting gun safety laws, the question is what will? But we know that the killing of little kids hasn't, because we can go back 10 years to Sandy Hook. We can go back to 1999 to Columbine. There's so many examples of kids being killed in school shootings, whether they're high school students like Columbine or Parkland High, or they're kids, little kids, kindergartners, first graders in Sandy Hook, and now third and fourth graders in this Robb Elementary School. Do you think we need more vivid images of what an AR-15 does to a 10-year-old's body? Will those grim and gruesome images, because we've heard some details where families had to give DNA because the kids' bodies were so destroyed that they were not recognizable. Some families won't have open caskets because they don't even have the full bodies of their kids. Do you think showing those images might move people?
Yeah, I mean, you would hope that that would help change people's perspectives about gun violence, and again, put in some sense gun laws in place, common sense gun laws. But I think that I imagine that politicians have access to a lot of information and data, and so I am assuming that they probably have had some exposure to these types of images over the last 10 plus years, and so it's really heartbreaking for me that we continue to see over years that these gun mass shootings are not decreasing, they're actually increasing. And so we know that this is a problem that needs to be addressed. And I don't really have an answer, as the chief mentioned, about sort of what can we do to really make politicians, change their perspectives about us, addressing this issue, because other countries are not having the same issue that we're having.
So mental health, Dr. Turner, we saw the governor do a whole song and dance about mental health, say things like these are isolated incidents. Yeah. First, he said the young man didn't have mental health issues. That was his first statement. And then he came out later and said, no, mental health is where we need to hang our hats. And every time we have one of these mass shootings, it's almost like a playbook. It's the thoughts and prayers, and then it's mental health. And I worry that people start associating people with mental health issues as being dangerous. And that's some of what the folks who don't want to deal with the gun issue, they want people to think that somehow, I think the governor even said anyone that shoots someone has a mental health issue. So first of all, I want you to address that. Is that true, that everyone that pulls the trigger and kills someone, do they have a mental health condition? And what are your thoughts about this constant association of mental health with mass shootings?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up. And as I was listening to the conversation with you and Chief Rambo, that really struck a nerve for me, because I think, this is a big problem in our society, where we continue to sort of put blame on mental health issues as why these mass shootings are occurring. When if we look at the data, it's a very small percentage of individuals who engage in this type of behavior in terms of mass shootings that actually have a mental illness. And so that's really a myth in terms of the frequency of people who have mental illness that are engaged in this type of behavior. Most people are not dangerous. And so there may be some psychological aspects to that, and that's different from sort of mental health. And so I want people to recognize that, obviously, like under that umbrella of psychology, mental health and mental illness is in that, but that's oftentimes not the contributing factor. I think there may be other types of things that may sort of relate to that, people's risk in terms of, how they engage with weapons is much different than someone with mental illness. And so I think we need to really fully understand that a little bit more, and not just sort of use that label, because it is stigmatizing and prevents people from actually getting the help that they need.
And so I guess, again, is your response that everybody that pulls a trigger and kills someone clearly does not have mental health? Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. That's not the case of the research.
Okay. And the research shows, as you said, that the majority of people who have mental illness are not dangerous.
Are not dangerous, and are less, or not sort of more likely to engage in gun violence compared to, someone walking on the street.
Is there a way from a psychological standpoint, because again, a lot of focus right now is on putting more mental health counselors, putting more mental health professionals in schools. Does psychology, have you advanced to the point where, say, a kid who isolates themselves, who draws, weird pictures like we saw that shooter in Grand Rapids, Michigan do, is there a profile that from a psychology standpoint, you can say, okay, this 12-year-old boy is exhibiting some symptoms that suggest that he, and typically it is a he, is going to be violent? Is there a way of doing that? Because some of these kids, the reason I'm asking is because some of these kids have had involvement, like the shooter in Buffalo had threatened to shoot the school, had threatened to shoot himself, and the police were called. So there are some of these cases where police have been called out, but yet nothing is done, or maybe there is something done on a temporary basis, but then the person goes on to commit some kind of mass shooting.
Yeah, so I mean, that's not an area of my research per se, but I think in terms of what I know around sort of assessment, psychological assessment, that the point that the chief mentioned earlier about threat assessments are really important. And what goes into that is really trying to understand what are all of these behaviors and situations that we can sort of pull on that may put them at a higher risk of engaging in impulsive behavior. And so I think one of the things that we know is that things like this are really hard to predict. It's really hard to predict that. Similar to if we think about suicide, it's really hard to predict that too. But if we know that someone is at a higher risk in terms of things like impulsivity, then we can sort of put things in place to prevent them from engaging in that type of behavior. So, removing access to weapons, may be one thing. And I know that, in Texas and in many other states, like they don't even have any sort of laws around having a license or doing some type of evaluation to see if someone is fit, to have a weapon. And I think those are things that we do need to be able to address.
Is there a particular red flag though, like the kid that kills their cat, or the kid that burns the dog's tail or something? Are there red flags like that that again correlate with someone becoming dangerous as they grow older?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen the research that provides enough evidence to say that those incidents correlate to that, but we do know that if we look at people that engage in harming animals, for example, that oftentimes they're more likely to engage in a number of dangerous types of behaviors or rule breaking as well. So I think those are the things that we do know. We don't know how that correlates to gun violence.
And when I think about it, even if you have a kid who has made a threat against a school, what are the limits? It seems like there's so many limitations in terms of people's rights to privacy and other rights that parents have and kids themselves have. Like, what do you do with that person? So you have an eighth grader who's exhibiting some, maybe signs of aggression or whatever those red flags might be. Maybe, child protective services are called out. But it's not like we're going to start institutionalizing and locking away kids who have even, red flag or abnormal behavior. So what can the psychology field or the mental health field even do?
Yeah, I mean, I think, legally as a licensed mental health professional, psychologists, counselors, we are mandated reporters. And so if someone is threatening, to hurt themselves or someone else, we have to report that to proper authorities to make sure that, their safety and other safety is important. So I think if we know that these types of things are happening, that we would have to, notify parents about those incidents, notify teachers, maybe not so much about who may be at sort of particular harm, but knowing that there is a person in this school environment that has put a threat. And so what can we do to sort of reduce or increase sort of safety for those individuals? So I think those are the things that we can do and reasons why we need to sort of do a better job around sort of threat assessments.
And just finally, Dr. Turner, parents all over this country are so afraid to send their kids to elementary school. There have been shootings on high school campuses. There's shootings on college campuses. So no matter what level your kid is in school in, there is some concern amongst parents. What would you tell, particularly parents now of younger kids, to tell their kids about what happened and how they should themselves feel about being inside a classroom?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's heartbreaking. And I've heard stories and seeing people post in regards to that exact thing where, immediately after the incident, many kids didn't want to go back to school or they were afraid. And so I think you do have to acknowledge that, it is potential for them to be harmed at this point and that it's okay to be nervous and scared. I think you do want to be honest. Don't try to, shield kids to say, oh, this is not going to happen to your school. We don't know if it's going to happen or not. So I think we have to really just be honest and say, I know that you're nervous. I know that you're afraid. We're going to do our best to try to protect you and give them the tools to know, like, what can they do, to get some help if there is a crisis and they need to sort of, cover or protect themselves in that environment so that they know, like, what can they do in those situations to sort of prepare them.
And just what do you think happens to this whole generation of kids who are growing up in these situations where they have to be engaged in active shooter drills, not just fire drills that all kids went through, but they actually have to do these active shooter drills. they have to hear about schools and kids that look like them that have been shot in these mass, shootings. What's going to happen to this whole generation of kids as they grow older? Are they going to either become so numb to violence that they just kind of disassociate, or does it make them more violent or have the potential for more violence themselves? What is this constant level? What does this constant exposure to violence do to our kids?
Yeah, I think that's the piece that we at least know a little bit about in terms of, again, looking at the research over decades in terms of gun violence in schools, that these kids can have some, short-term, difficulties that I mentioned before in terms of, trauma, some of the sadness and some of the anxiety. But long-term, we see some of those similar things, particularly for kids who may be at those actual incidents when they do occur. And so I think long-term, it's not going to necessarily make those kids more likely to engage in this type of behavior or be numb to the experience. But I think it does have the potential to increase mental health difficulties among these kids in terms of some of the anxiety, the trauma, the PTSD. And so I think really making sure that you check in on kids to get a sense about where they are with their mental health. How much does their sadness or anxiety last over time? And if you see that lingering, to make sure that you get that support and find them a therapist to help them process those experiences to really reduce, long-term difficulties in adulthood.
And just even for adults, is it going to make us, develop agoraphobia or other kinds of conditions because fear of going to the grocery store, fear of going to church, fear of going to a shopping mall, fear of going to a movie theater? What impact is this having on adults?
Yeah, I definitely think, short term, it makes people sort of rethink things and maybe change their behavior. So people may be very on alert to threat. I've even seen people, decide to do more, ordering in groceries now as opposed to going to the grocery store. So I think short term is definitely going to change a lot of our behaviors around these situations. Long term, I'm not sure, we don't have much research about that, but I think we do want to be mindful about sort of what is the mental health impact of this. Taking media breaks, I think, is really important so that we can really, if you're seeing these images, we know that increases potential risk for different trauma reactions. And so don't just sit and watch the TV or scroll through Instagram all day because that could increase your exposure and lead to more mental health challenges.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Turner. This is obviously a lot for all of us. And, the great advice of always taking those mental health breaks and not just consuming all of this negative news, because even though many of us don't know these victims or their families, we feel heartbroken. And as a country, we are mourning as well. I was watching that funeral, which I shouldn't have been doing, the 84-year-old, and feeling like it was a family member. But so much to process. Again, thank you again, Dr. Turner's book is Mental Health Among Diverse Racial Communities. That's his specialty. His book is Mental Health Among African Americans. Thank you always for helping us sort out these really difficult issues. All right, my next guest is Alex Barrio. He's an expert on gun violence prevention. He works at the Center for American Progress, and he's worked at the congressional level and has been studying the development and the evolution of gun safety laws over the last couple of decades in this country. And welcome back, Alex. Thank you for coming back. You were on with us right after the shooting. I want to have you back because we learned a lot since the shooting. We saw that NRA convention happen on Friday, a couple of days after the shooting. I was really shocked, Alex, by the fact that the NRA, that loves guns so much and is in control of so many of the gun policies in this country, had a no gun policy. Couldn't get into the arena with a gun. What's that about?
Well, good afternoon. Thank you again for having me. And it makes perfect sense, and it's typical of the NRA. They know how dangerous guns are. They know that especially when you have prominent elected officials, they're going to be dangerous people who may seek a claim to fame, as what happened with Reagan in '81, by engaging in a violent act against a prominent celebrity official. And so they know that to be safe, they have to keep guns out of their conventions, out of their regular meetings, and out of their buildings.
Yeah, such irony in that, right? So here they are advocating for the good guy with a gun is the way you deal with a bad guy with a gun. And we heard Trump say that again. That was echoed throughout. but yet they didn't want the good guys to be in their convention with guns. So much hypocrisy in that. Uh, I asked Chief Rambo this question, and you may know because you've seen so many of these groups oppose and support gun safety legislation. But why haven't we seen more police come out in favor of banning assault weapons for the quote unquote bad guys, since they are the ones that by their very commitment to being police officers are charged to run into these very dangerous situations. And now we're seeing police officers, nobody wants to call them, non-heroes or want to talk about what may have driven their hesitancy in Parkland and in this Robb Elementary School. But let's be fair, some of these cops are probably afraid to run into these active shooter situations. So why are they the loudest folks on this assault weapons bandwagon?
It's a question we grapple with among the many gun violence prevention groups all over the country, and there is division among law enforcement. It is not uniform. There are lots of law enforcement officials who do seek to ban assault weapons, especially older folks who were there from 94 to 04 when we had a ban on assault weapons and mass shootings dropped significantly before a huge spike in 2005 and when the assault weapons ban was allowed to expire. And so there are people there. There are law enforcement who actually are veterans who have been in war, seen what these weapons do and want them banned. But it is a divisive topic because, again, law enforcement, just like every other community, there are people there who like these guns, who want to collect these guns, who value these guns, and who hold the right to acquire these guns in higher esteem than even potentially the danger to themselves and their community.
Yeah. Any movement since we've had a lot of talk since there's been assessment of what happened at Robb Elementary School. The NRA obviously had their convention. We know that there's been conversations about bipartisan legislation, but are you seeing the needle move with some of those Republicans who've been so staunchly anti-gun safety legislation, like Mitch McConnell?
So as of now, the Republicans are extremely quiet. Mitch McConnell said he's going to let the negotiations happen. Senator Cornyn is negotiating. The Republican Senator Cornyn from Texas is negotiating with Senator Murphy from Connecticut on some sort of package. The House, though, is moving swiftly. They have the Raise the Age Act, which would raise the age of buying a gun to 21 across the entire country. Bills to prevent gun trafficking, safe storage laws, closing the bump stock loopholes to ban them permanently, and school safety bills, right? So there's a total of 8 packages. There will be votes as an omnibus package. There may also be votes on each individual piece. Unfortunately, there is not an assault weapons ban at this time. The House leadership doesn't think they have the votes on the floor in this moment to pass that. But those 8 packages those 8 bills rather in this package are all common sense legislation. Over 80% of the American public supports it. And so we hope that the Senate will consider those items and potentially pass them. I am, at this point, cautiously optimistic. The negotiations are happening. The gravity of these past 10 days. And then remember, this past weekend, Memorial Day, like every long weekend, there were another at least 7 mass shootings where 4 more people were shot in public. And so the crisis is continuing, and we have to do something to get guns out of the hands of these dangerous people that are getting them way too easily.
Do you expect any Republican support in the House for any of these 8 bills?
I do think there might be a few Republicans around the country who are, more moderate on this issue. There are people from California, there's Chris Smith from New Jersey who has spoken out in favor of this. There's a bunch of moderates in Michigan and Ohio who are retiring. And so I do think there's potential there, especially for those who are leaving Congress, to potentially support this common sense legislation, especially in places that are experiencing gun violence. I don't think the congressman from Uvalde, unfortunately, is going to support this bill, but he is with the mainstream Republicans. So it's going to be a handful in the House. And then we'll see about getting 10 in the Senate.
Yeah, Joe Manchin said he would be in favor of some gun legislation if there were 10 Republicans. But when you do the numbers count, it doesn't seem like there are 10 Republicans who are going to go as far as these 8 bills that are going to come out of the House.
No, it doesn't seem like that at that point, at this point. So we don't know what's going to happen. You know, Senator Manchin is letting Senator Murphy from Newtown lead the way on this, as he's been doing for years, pushing these bills to the floor. You know, Manchin led the way to try to get a background checks vote in 2013. That was unsuccessful. 4 Democrats ultimately ended up voting against Manchin's own bill. And so we hope that, you know, letting some of these other legislative leaders take the lead on this will create a package. I do believe that in the end, Senator Manchin will support gun violence prevention legislation. I do think there are some Republicans who are really on board, you know, at least a handful who really, really want something done, really want some action. If we get to 10, and then if we let the inability to get 10 keep Democrats from passing gun violence prevention legislation, though, I do think it is frustrating. You know, it will be detrimental to the caucus and to the cause. Ultimately, there are some elements of these that could be passed through reconciliation with just 50 votes. Whether or not Democrats will go that route, however, remains to be seen.
Yeah, so Marco Rubio, you know, up for re-election, Ted Cruz in Texas. We know we're not going to get the votes of those prominent Southern senators, even though Cornyn from Texas is leading with Chris Murphy in terms of negotiating. But Ted Cruz has staked out a pretty strident position on this. He's like put an armed guard in front of a door, one way in, one way out of schools. So that seems to be the prevailing norm, that Ted Cruz, even though, you know, others aren't as vocal as he is. So, and it feels like to me, Alex, that the Republicans are doing what they typically do, is let this news cycle pass. And although the news has been really intense around Robb Elementary for the last week, just peruse your national papers today, and you'll see the stories have dropped really to the bottom of the news feed. So what prevents this from just being another moment where we express outrage, give thoughts and prayers? The president goes, you know, and does what our president, the Democratic president, typically does, but the Republicans let the news cycle move on.
Yeah, I mean, it's frustrating. On the one hand, we do have to recognize that there are Republican senators who are just not serious legislators. They're obsessed with running for president. They're going to run for president in a couple of years. It's not just Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio. It's also Josh Hawley from Missouri and a couple others around the country, right? They're obsessed with national attention. And so they're saying ridiculous things like one door per school. I mean, literally any firefighter will tell you that that is the most dumb idea in the history of the world.
You're like, burn the kids up in a building.
It's so ridiculous. You know, we have multiple exits for a reason. On the other hand, you know, we can't let those things distract us. This is why Cornyn is so important, right? He is the #2 leader in the Republicans. If he does signal that there is a package, just like a few months ago when they did infrastructure, right? The bipartisan infrastructure deal, I believe it was 18 Republicans who voted for it in the end. Like, if Cornyn moves forward and says, look, we have a package here, it is moderate, it is common sense, it is middle of the road, let's do it, then I do believe you will have these serious senators who are not focused on national attention and appearing on Fox News, but people like Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, potentially Rob Portman from Ohio. You know, there's a few others, you know, Mitt Romney, who has really staked his claim on being the sort of bipartisan bridge builder.
Let's talk about him for a second. Sure. Mitt Romney, they showed all the senators who accept money from NRA. He's like the #1 dude that accepts the most money from the NRA. So how is Mitt Romney, is he going to cross the NRA? And, you know, is the NRA really now representing your average gun owner, or they just become the mouthpiece for gun manufacturers? So, you know, where is the NRA today? Because you've told us before, it's really their organizing ability that makes them so powerful. But are they organizing for everyday gun owners or really for those manufacturers?
Right. They are organizing everyday gun owners on behalf of the policies of the manufacturers, right? So it's like they are supporting these policies that are basically like, manufacture and sell as many guns as you can to as many people as you can, no matter the consequences. And their activist supporters, their email list, buy that up and go for it. Romney is interesting because he is somebody who has staked his claim as a moderate, who is coming from an area, Salt Lake City are the fastest growing suburbs in the entire country. And those are people that are seeing this issue and are really, really worried about their kids. Salt Lake City area has one of the most robust public school systems in the country. Utah has one of the highest concentrations of guns, and they've seen huge surges in gun violence on the suicide front. The numbers are they're one of the worst states in the country for gun suicide. And so there is a lot of desire among his constituents to really do something about this and get something done to protect these children. Will he cross the NRA? I mean, we'll see. And it also depends on, is the NRA ultimately going to see a moderate, sensible package and decide that they're going to start primarying Republicans to get rid of it? I mean, Romney's up in 2024. We'll see if he even runs for re-election. But if he does, are they really going to make that a focus, or focus on other races, or focus on the president? Like, who knows? But, it does take a lot of courage, frankly, to stand up and say, this is the right thing to do, and I'm going to do it. He did it by voting for the Trump impeachment. This is another, profile in courage. Will he do it again?
Is there anything different today in the country versus where we were 10 years ago with Sandy Hook? I mean, we couldn't get this done with, the slaughter of little white kids. Now we got the slaughter of Black and brown people. What's different? Like, what's going to move some of these senators today? I mean, some of them are new, they weren't around in Sandy Hook, but is there anything different about the country that makes you think it's more likely to happen today than 10 years ago?
It's the exhaustion. I mean, I think everybody in this country is tired of the daily gun violence that we're dealing with. They're tired of being afraid of dropping their kids off to school. I mean, how many parents have you spoken to, or do you know in this country that every day drop their kids off to school with abject terror? I mean, my nephew's in 6th grade and he walks to school a mile every day. And every morning I think about that walk, and it's like, what is he going to find when he gets there? Is it going to be a normal day, or is something terrifying going to happen? And I think we're just tired of that after 10 years. And even if it doesn't happen this year, we have an election in a few months. The crisis moment where things flip is coming. It may not be right now, but we're going to try to see if it is right now. But if it's not, it's coming. We cannot, as a country, continue to tolerate this sort of an unreasonable amount of violence when the entire rest of the Western world has figured out you just have to make these guns harder to buy for dangerous people. Slight changes don't affect the Second Amendment, but they will make us safer.
Do you see, and I imagine in this 8 bills, there's nothing to repeal the law that shields these gun manufacturers. So the Congress is not touching that this time around.
No, that is not in there. It's definitely, the Senate will definitely not go for it. And even the House, again, you have a majority. You have these gun manufacturers operate in the state, right? They're in Massachusetts, they're in New Hampshire, they're in Maine. They have Democratic members, Democratic constituents are some of these places. And so it's very, very difficult for them to move against such legislation. In the future, I do think it will happen. But remember, the lawsuit shielding gun manufacturers from liability does allow for marketing practices. And so now they are looking into Daniel Defense, the manufacturers of this AR-15, who have literal ads with children in them. And so, did they violate marketing practices in an illegal fashion? We know that in New York, the state is moving to do litigation against the gun manufacturers. Connecticut, they've already done it after Newtown. We'll see if something comes out of that from these survivor families in Texas in terms of the way that Daniel Defense marketed their AR-15 to parents and to children.
And just briefly, let's talk about this confirmation of the alcohol, tobacco, and firearm chief, that, this agency that was set up some 20 years ago to be the agency to address this gun violence that has been pretty much weakened. I was reading these horrible reports that, this 2003 amendment by this Republican Congressman Tyhart, I guess his name is, tied the hands of this agency and prohibited the agency from releasing gun tracing data. Gun dealers don't have to turn over information about their sales and inventory. And the one that really drove me crazy was prohibiting the agency from digitizing records to the point where there are boxes and boxes of records stored in a building, so many that they caused the floor to collapse in this Virginia warehouse. And here this again, this amendment by a Republican has weakened this agency to the point they haven't had a confirmed leader in years, and the agency has pretty much been MIA in these shootings. Are you hopeful? I know there's been some hearings on Steve Dettelbach, who's the Biden appointee now, that he might get confirmed over the next couple of weeks or so. Will his confirmation do anything as long as you have that 2003 amendment?
So two things. On the one hand, yes, his confirmation will be helpful. The last ATF director that was confirmed, now this job was only made confirmable by the Senate in 2003. And so there's only been one confirmed ATF director. We've only had interim directors before that. But the last confirmation was after the Sandy Hook shooting. B. Todd Jones, he served there for 2 years before retiring. Now, we do think there is, of course, an analogous situation, unfortunately, an analogous tragedy, another elementary school shooting, another ATF nominee. The ATF strength is in coordinating local law enforcement and in regulating gun dealers, so that when gun dealers do engage in illegal transactions, Texas is the #1 gun trafficker in the entire country. Most illegal guns in the whole country, the most of them come from Texas, Georgia, and Florida. That is where the guns flow all the way up to Chicago and then south of the border down to Mexico, Mexico City, and Central America. And so the ability to crack down on that, to crack down on gun dealers who are selling to minors, selling without proper background checks, bring those people down, will reduce the number of illegal guns and thus the number of shootings across the country. In terms of the Tiahrt amendments, what they do is they do forbid ATF from sharing that data with researchers, right? They argue, and the NRA argues, there's proprietary information in there from the gun manufacturers side, but also the side of the consumers. And so only law enforcement is able to see those records, not data analysis, not researchers, et cetera. And of course, they're all kept in paper in, as you noted, coal mines in West Virginia, basically. And so however, what has changed since then, though, is the repeal of a different amendment called the Dickey Amendment in the 90s, which, named after another Republican representative named Representative Dickey, who made it so that the CDC could not do research on gun violence prevention. That was repealed a few years ago. So now we have a lot of research and data that we're able to collect. On top of that, the ATF can collect data. It won't have the impact of the actual gun sale data that they're getting from the gun makers. We won't be able to transfer that directly to researchers. However, they can build research teams to aggregate it, to study it, and to allow for researchers to look at those issues.
Wow. So hopeful that this nominee from Biden does get confirmed. That seems likely.
Yeah, I do think, I'm sorry, the light has gone off in my room. So this is a sensor. Sorry, but yes, there is a lot of optimism right now. Senator King, who was the deciding vote last time under the last nominee, has spoken favorably of him. We will know in a couple weeks. The vote will be at the end of June following this package of bills, which the Senate looks like they're going to be moving towards on next week, June 6th. House votes this week, Senate will vote next week, and then we'll see where the chips lie.
All right, Alice, we're gonna have to have you back again because, I'm just hoping this is not another, situation where the news moves on, the Republicans wait it out and they do nothing. Hopefully we'll get the confirmation of this ATF director, which you said, will have some impact, and we get some of these bills, some of the 8 actually passed in the House, and then hopefully pass in the Senate as well and make their way to Joe Biden's desk. Lots to consider as we, again, mourn the loss of so many kids, teachers, and then those families again in Buffalo. Can't forget those families as well. And all the families. You said there were 7 mass shootings over the weekend?
At least 7 mass shootings, yep, over this past weekend between Saturday morning and yesterday evening.
And where were those? I didn't even see them myself.
Golly, they were all over the country. We're looking at,
Wow.
golly, where is it? I just got the email about it. It looks like, I don't even have the details yet. There was one at a graduation party. I mean, they were all over the place. That was in Gadsden, Alabama. So there's just a lot. They were all over the place. But it happens every holiday weekend, right? You have a long weekend and people act foolish. They exaggerate, and we see a lot of aggression and stuff. So they were all over the country, and there's going to be more every week until we do something.
Every day, every weekend, people's lives are lost in these shootings. And I do think as a country, like you said, there were 7. There maybe even I'm hearing numbers, maybe as many as 14. The numbers are too big to even keep up with. We can't, we move from one story to the next so quickly. We can't even keep up with these mass shootings. And we have, as a country, just accepted them as normal when they should not be normal. But again, thank you so much, Alex, for always joining us and helping us make sense of this. We'll be checking back in with you for sure as we continue to follow this story. I want to thank all of my guests today. Always difficult to talk about these issues, but if we don't acknowledge it, we definitely can't solve it. And hopefully, as Alex is sharing, Congress and the Senate is moving towards passing some kind of gun safety legislation. Obviously, we know whatever they come up with at this moment is going to be better than nothing, but it's not going to be enough to save kids and to save families and communities from these tragedies that Dr. Turner tells us, it's impacting all of our mental health. We've got to find ways to do better in this country. We know what to do. We just got to find the will to do it. My words to live by. God bless a country that values guns over kids. I cannot believe that this is what we want the legacy of this country to be, that we want to give our kids, my kids, your kids, the next generation, a country where we say we want to protect gun manufacturers and we want to protect gun lobbyists over protecting the lives of little kids. And until we enact gun safety legislation in this country, that's exactly the message we're sending. And we can do better. I'm Aja. Be safe out there. Remember, we're all in this together.